Hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual event, CBAM and ETS, where we're going to be asking, do their current designs aid EU climate ambitions? My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm coming at you live from the Euractiv studios at the heart of the EU quarter. Now, today we're going to be talking about the EU emissions trading system, which has been on a roller coaster ride over the past 15 years, and how it will intersect with the proposed Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, otherwise known when the WTO isn't listening as a carbon import tax, although that is certainly a controversial term. Now, this week, we saw the price of carbon trade close to 97 euros per ton, a far cry from the 7 euros we were at just a few years ago. The rise is the result of a market intervention several years ago, which aimed to raise the flagging price of carbon in the ETS, which was too low to produce the incentives needed for emissions trading to function properly. So now that the ETS price is starting to bite, the European Commission last year proposed the CBAM as a way to prevent carbon leakage, which is a phenomenon when companies might move their production outside the European Union in order to avoid ETS and other climate policy costs. Now, importers under this proposal will have to buy carbon certificates corresponding to the carbon price that would have been paid had the goods been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules. But if a non-EU producer can show they have already paid a price for the carbon used in the production of the imported goods in a third country, in other words, if that third country has equivalent climate legislation, the corresponding cost can be fully deducted for the EU importer. Now, the Commission hopes that the EU will never have to apply the CBAM, and that the pressure it creates will be enough to motivate third countries to get their climate legislation to the same level as the EU. But it's a controversial proposal and risks running afoul of World Trade Organization free trade rules. It is, for the moment, just a proposal. It needs to be accepted by the European Parliament and the European Council, made up of the 27 national governments of the EU, and they could amend the proposal in all kinds of different ways. So the CBAM will progressively become an alternative to the free ETS allowances that have been given out to mediate potential carbon leakage up until now. Free allowances under the proposal will be phased out as from 2026. Many energy-intensive industries will be particularly affected by this transition. The steel industry, for instance, estimates that the combined impact of CBAM and the loss of free allowances in the ETS will cost nearly 14 billion euros in 2030 under a business-as-usual scenario. So, what's in store in the coming years if CBAM comes to pass? And how can we make sure this transition from the free allowances to a CBAM import cost system will run smoothly? We've assembled a panel of experts and policymakers to discuss this issue today. Let me introduce them now. We have with us Maria Elena Scopio, Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration at DG Tax UD at the European Commission. We have Swedish Liberal MEP Emma Weisner, a member of the European Parliament's Environment Committee. We have Finnish centre-left MEP Mia-Petra Kumpula-Natri, a member of the Industry and the Energy Committee at the European Parliament. We have Judith Curtin-Darling, Deputy General Secretary for the Trade Union Confederation Industrial. We have Oliver Sartor, Senior Advisor for Industry at the think tank Agora Energiewende. And finally, we have Axel Eggert, Director General for the European Steel Association, Eurofer. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Now, you guys at home will be able to ask your questions to the panelists using the Q&A feature on Slido, which you should be seeing if you're on the Euractiv page now. You can go ahead and type those questions in starting now if you already know what you'd like to ask the panelists, and I'll be reading out your questions to the panelists later on in the event. So, Maria, let's start with you. Of course, the Commission's perspective here is really important because that's where the proposal has come from. Tell us how the Commission envisages that CBAM and the ETS are going to intersect.
Yes, good afternoon, Dave, and thanks a lot for the invitation of your active. I'd like to welcome all the other panelists and the audience who is currently listening to us. I would just try to introduce a few points on CBAM. CBAM is not a tax, is not a tariff, is not a trade policy instrument. It is a purely climate regulatory instrument. And its relationship with EU ETS is extremely close. In fact, this complements totally the EU ETS. They will have the same carbon price applied to imports and to domestic products. Without an effective EU ETS, CBAM would not make sense. In fact, CBAM, what is it? It's just the external aspect of the ETS. It's the other side of the coin. And then, if you keep this in mind, you can easily understand its rationale. You have very correctly reminded the two main principles on which CBAM is based. There is same carbon pricing, so we will make third country producers pay the same as EU companies pay. And if they don't pay, there will be no adjustment. The second principle is no double pricing. The adjustment will not be applied on top of the carbon prices that have been charged in third countries if they are effectively paid. So you see the interactions between CBAM and ETS are really very, very, very close. And not only they're close from an intellectual point of view, but also from a timing point of view. If ETS is a remedy to carbon leakage, CBAM is supposed to apply progressively as long as free allowances will be phased out. There is normally a misconception in the relationship between these two elements. Some stakeholders consider that if we don't have CBAM, we will keep the free allowances forever. But in fact, it's exactly the other way around. The linear reduction of the ETS free allowances is already a fact. And CBAM is there to compensate for this reduction. It's there to offer a protection, to offer a solution to the fact that free allowances will have to be phased out nonetheless. Just a word on its state of play. We are now discussing in the Council. There is a special group which has been set, and there are several standing committees in the European Parliament that are looking at our proposal. The leading ones are ENVI and INTA, as you may know, but we also have Budget, Econ, ITRE, DEVE, Comagri that are involved. And the ENVI will vote the final report in May. We will hope to have our negotiating mandate by the summer and start negotiating in July, September for a possible adoption in this year still. It's important to say that CBAM will only enter into force in a theoretical base. It will start in 2023, but there will now be financial adjustments until 2026. These 3 years will be important to check its impacts, the way it works, the administrative burden, to have a dry run, in fact, not to have to hit companies with anything that may hurt them. We will see how it works. Then, after these 3 years, there will be its effective and progressive entry into force, and it will enter into force as long as the ETS allowances will be phased in. This is very important because if this wasn't the case, we would be infringing WTO. And infringing WTO principle is in no one's interest. It risks of backfiring. It would risk of no other third countries applying our CBAM. Therefore, we would be without free allowances and with no protection because we've been infringing WTO. And also we would have possible trade wars that could be started. We have considered that then 10 years to have the full implementation of CBAM and the full disappearance of free allowances should be enough to give time to adjust to companies. Therefore, we hope that this device is going to help the industry rather than hamper it. It is done to give an additional protection while trying to preserve the environment in the EU, but also outside the EU. And we frankly hope that this is going to be understood and possibly, you said never applied. Well, we say that a successful CBAM should actually disappear as soon as possible if it ever had to be applied. So thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Maria. I think that's a very clear explanation of where the Commission's coming from on this. And as you mentioned, we've got a legislative process ahead of us. It's going to be a fun couple months for you, I imagine. Emma, you are representing the Parliament side of this. Of course, you're more focused. Yes, Emma. Yeah. You are more focused on the ETS side of this. So from your perspective, the CBAM, is it going to be successful in stopping carbon leakage as it intersects with the ETS? And how can we keep that intersection functioning correctly?
Yes, indeed. That's the first and short answer to that question. So first of all, just let me introduce myself. My name is Emma Wiester. I'm a new MEP since 1 year. I'm an engineer in energy by training, and I'm very happy to be the Renew Shadow Rapporteur on the ETS. So what I'm focusing on, especially the link between ETS and CBAM, is then the ETS approach to it, also making the ETS fit for 1.5 degree, I would say. The linkage with CBAM, it's complex, but it's absolutely necessary, and I think that is what will make it successful. We just heard the Commission. It's not a tax; it is a carbon price, a supplement, a complement to the ETS. Really making sure that we have an effect, regardless if you're producing in Belfast or in Beijing, if it's in Shanghai or in Zagreb, if it's in China or Copenhagen. It shouldn't matter. It is the price. The price that we have to pay to emit, and I think that is key if we are to be successful in combating climate change. From my end, in my opening remarks, I was thinking, what should I say in order to make an introduction? And basically, we in Renew Europe, being very much in the center of the Parliament, being very pro-market and also pro-carbon pricing, we have 4 different bullets I want to give you as a start and food of thought. The first one is the ambition level of the ETS. We really need to make sure ETS is fit for 1.5 degree. We don't believe 55% is enough. So we really need to make the ETS fit for the ambition level. We really want to boost innovation. So, there's a whole lot of money collected, revenues from the ETS and the CBAM that needs to be then really going and boosting innovation and transforming society. We therefore want to rebrand the innovation fund into a net zero fund, being able also to upscale a lot of innovations and large-scale deployment of new innovations, sort of boosting the scope of the innovation fund, and also focus more on carbon sinks. So really make it a net zero fund, taking us to the ambition level that we want. The third one, I'm especially proud of being market-driven liberal, is that we need to let the market do its work. We really need to make sure that the ETS and also the CBAM, and for me especially the ETS, is fit for purpose and let the markets do its work. Auctioning is the main tool of allocating ETS allowances, and we should really build the system around auctioning. We also want to avoid distortion and exemptions, really creating a level playing field. Therefore, I will come forward with several proposals on, for example, topics like indirect cost compensation, waste to energy facilities that being now outside of the scope of the ETS that could be included in the scope. And finally, the fourth one of my opening remarks is we should not punish the frontrunners. We really need to make ETS a scheme where we really boost innovation, supporting our frontrunners. So whatever we do when it comes to CBAM and ETS, we really need to make sure that it's fit for purpose, boosting and helping the ones running in the front, and not setting up new hindrance. For example, the benchmarks is one of the things I really want to change in order to really be able to support our front runners. And that's specifically interesting when we're going to talk about steel, which we're going to do later. So I'm going to save that one. But these 4, the ambition level, the boosting the innovation, let the market do its work, and not punish the front runners. That are my main elements, and what Renew will focus on in the entire ETS CBAM debate.
Thanks, Emma. That's particularly good to hear about the specific amendments you're planning, particularly on that indirect cost compensation. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Mia Petra, let's go to you next. You're also dealing with ETS. Would you characterize the CBAM as being intended as an eventual replacement for free allowances? And does this pose excessive cost risks for that transition period?
Thank you. Greetings from Brussels. I'm a Finnish MEP working also for the INTA committee, the trade. So I look with a great interest that how CBAM is taking up into the use and how it's functioning. And excuse me, that is also, even I'm working on the ETS, I do closely cooperate with the industry committee people on the CBAM, how we will get it fit for purpose. On the big picture, I think this is important to see how the implementation of CBAM is happening. And at the moment, we are elaborating our views on the documents and papers, provided them to ENVI, but then also we have some shared competencies. And we will look very carefully that if the CBAM is functioning the way it should. I do have many amendments now delivered, and my own also is that how do we analyze the implementation of the CBAM impact assessment should really look the climate perspective, that how the emissions are developing, and then our exports and industry, how is it developing? It is important sector for our European well-being that we do not just cut down the jobs, but cut down the emissions. So I really supporting the big picture that ETS has a price for polluter pays, but it's also when we import and that fitting together CBAM and ETS is needed. Then the price for the transition period, as you asked, at the moment I'm for the opinion, we are discussing in the parliament that it needs to be analyzed. And the Commission's proposal is very technical. It sets the years that after 3 years, we know how the phase out will be, and then the CBAM come instead, without never be tested. So there might be that there will be some strong opinions, not only me, but even the industry committee, that we should analyze it and then look the path to the end. I don't know if it's a majority of the parliament or how, but this I think is a question mark on the Commission proposal, that how can we guarantee it works. And the second one is that it makes the level playing field in Europe, but it doesn't make a level playing field for the European exporters. And that is very big question. If we have better steel, for example, produced in Europe than produced in Turkey or produced in China, and we are exporting to the North Africa, or we are exporting to USA, only ours carries the price, and that is the question in the air. Thank you for this first introduction, some thoughts.
Thanks. So definitely we're hearing from the Parliament's perspective, you guys are looking at this very closely, analyzing it and thinking about what changes could be made. Judith, let's go to you next from Industrial's perspective. How do you think that the CBAM and the accompanying changes to how the ETS functions are going to affect workers in these sectors?
Thanks very much, Dave, and it's a real pleasure to follow on from Mia Petra, in fact, in this introduction round, because from Industrial Europe's perspective, we're representing steel workers right across Europe, about 300,000 workers in the steel industry. And what we have to put into the context and into the mix is that this is actually a crucial decade for our steel industry across Europe. In any case, with or without the Fit for 55 package, because around half of our blast furnaces will need to be renovated or replaced in this decade. So there's a colossal challenge in terms of industrial transformation going on at the same time that we are pressing for deeper decarbonisation. And as Industrial Europe, as trade unions, we are fully subscribed to the objectives of net carbon neutrality by 2050 and the 2030 target. targets, but we need to do that within a strong industrial policy framework. And carbon pricing alone is not an industrial policy framework. And therefore, the reform of the ETS has to be placed in that bigger picture. We would like to see a European Steel Action Plan with environmental and the ETS and the CBAM as one element in the toolbox, but with the other pieces of the jigsaw put together to ensure that sustainable transformation of our industry over this decade. And we're facing intense global competition. As Mia Petra just said, we have intense global competition in terms of imports into the European market and carbon leakage as a result of others not following the same stringent requirements. But equally, we have competition in export markets. And therefore, the design of the CBAM and the reform of the ETS has to reflect really both sides of the card. And for European workers, I was struck by Maria Elena's comment that CBAM will be theoretical at the beginning. Well, for European steel workers, carbon leakage isn't theoretical. This is something that we have experienced now over many years, and that's why people are extremely nervous about how these changes will come, and why we want to ensure that the introduction of a CBAM, something that trade unions have been calling for a long time, will be done in a very careful way. And finally, what we would like to see to ensure that that transformation is socially just as well is far more social conditionality added into the funding streams, the revenue streams which are coming out of these instruments. So whether it's free allocations or whether it's CBAM revenues and other earmarked funds from the ETS, the Innovation Fund, as well as the Modernisation Fund, we think that there should be stronger links to the objective of the Green Deal to deliver a just transition for workers and communities linked to those funds. And there should be clear just transition plans in companies that receive those European funds. And in that way, we think the reform of the ETS, together with the introduction of a CBAM, could really contribute to being part of the jigsaw puzzle of that broader industrial plan for our steel industry in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Oliver, let's go to you next. I think you can really give us the context here about how all of this fits into the wider energy transition. What do you think is the ideal outcome of this CBAM exercise, and what could possibly go wrong?
Well, it's difficult to answer that question in 2 minutes, but I will try. So in terms of the ideal outcome, I think there are a few criteria that are important. So one is we need a CBAM to be implemented, right? For the reasons that have been explained by previous speakers. We have to find an alternative solution to carbon leakage, especially for the period after 2030, because free allocation won't last forever. CBAM also comes with some other benefits in terms of carbon cost pass-through, the funding that can be generated for net zero funds or funds for the Innovation Fund, funding carbon contracts for difference, which we desperately need to support the steel sector's decarbonisation efforts. As well as the fact that CBAM also sends, I think, the right signal globally that we need to gradually move our global trading markets from brown products to green products. So for all these reasons, part of the ideal outcome is that CBAM is implemented. Another key aspect, though, is one of the really important parts of the Commission's proposal is that the free allocation that would have gone to CBAM sectors that is now auctioned to those sectors is essentially recycled into the Innovation Fund, and that is used in essence to support an accelerated transition for these very emissions intensive sectors. And that's really important. Some of the key technologies we're talking about are more expensive than what is economic today, even with high carbon prices. There is a need to de-risk some of those technologies which are very capital intensive and relatively immature. And therefore, the funding that can be gathered before 2030 is critical to catch this decade. If the EU doesn't move fast to decarbonise sectors such as steel, and we don't create the right policy framework, we risk basically being left behind and to not be competitive, and our sector may actually disappear. So it's very important that we connect this to the broader package of measures, and in particular, the money we can raise from the Innovation Fund. That has the consequence, though, that we can't, the money has to come from somewhere. So we can't just perpetuate free allocation at the full benchmark level until 2030. While on the other hand, we have to be careful about how quickly we phase it in. So a balance is needed here in terms of the timing, and we need to get that balance right. Maybe the other part of an ideal outcome, I think, would be we have to fix or tweak some of the what Agora would see as slight weaknesses in the Commission's proposal, or by and large the proposal is very good. One is we need to mitigate the risk, I think, of international opposition and retaliation. And I think one of the ways we can do this is, as the rapporteur, Mohamed Chambers, proposed, is to ensure that equivalent money flows back to least developed countries for international climate finance. That's quite important. The second one is we need to make sure the CBAM is actually effective. That's absolutely crucial. And therefore, the capacity of our customs infrastructure to adequately verify and to catch false declarations and so on, to ensure that the accredited certifiers are doing their jobs correctly, all of that's extremely important. And we have historic disinvestment in this infrastructure for the last 10, 20 years, and we will desperately need to strengthen this infrastructure. So that's a critical component as well. Thirdly, we will need a solution for exports. This is a complex issue because frankly, the WTO is not very clear on this issue. The rules were not designed for this kind of problem, and therefore you basically don't know if it's legal or not until you have a test case. But the uncertainty means that there is some risk of implementing a rebate, and so we need to conduct an appropriate risk assessment here of how we proceed. Our proposal would be to probably not have a rebate initially, but to modify the rate of free allocation phase initially to reflect that, but to reserve the possibility to introduce protection for exports in the form of continued free allocation to the exported production from 2030 onwards. And then finally, we have to also commit, I think, to including indirect emissions in the CBAM from 2030, maybe not initially because of some concerns around resource shuffling, but from 2030, we think that's much less of a risk. And so if we do not include indirect emissions in the CBAM scope, eventually the risk is that you will have circumvention where foreign importers will shift from fossil fuels to fossil-based electricity and circumvent the CBAM that way. So that can't happen. What could go wrong? Very quickly, we think, some of the flip side of some of the issues I mentioned, right? So if we fail to provide a solution for exports that is credible, that leaves their options open, I think it will be very difficult to actually implement any kind of phase-out of free allocation meaningfully in the long run, and therefore to have a system that can actually fly in the longer term. So we need a solution there. We also, as I said, though, that requires a balancing of how quickly we phase in the mechanism. There's risks to going too fast and to going too slow, in particular for the funding that you raise for the transition. So a balance is needed there. Another thing that could go wrong is the scope could be enlarged beyond what is reasonable at this stage. So, for example, there's some proposals to include chemicals, all organic chemicals and plastics in the CBAM currently, or to include indirect emissions immediately. We think this could be quite counterproductive in terms of the complexity it would create, as well as the potential level of opposition it might create in the case of chemicals from certain key trading partners such as the United States at this point. So there's some other things that can go wrong, but hopefully we're in the safe hands of our legislators and the Commission and the Council, and we'll be able to steer through these risks.
Thanks a lot. Let's go to Axel next. So Axel, for the steel sector in particular, does the transition from free allowances to CBAM pose risks, and what kind of risks might be there?
Thank you, Dave. It is certainly a risk for the European steel industry as the Commission puts forward currently the proposal to phase out free allocation when phasing in CBAM. I hope we can still discuss this also with the Commission, while the Parliament and the Council are already now looking for solutions. We are not against phasing out of free allocation, but the CBAM has to be tested on its effectiveness first, before free allocation is further being reduced. In particular, when with the carbon levy at the border implemented only in 2026, So only then we will see whether the system is working or not. And that period will take 2 to 3 years. And in this period, we need to keep the free allocation level as it is already today. Then the question is, will exporters in that period absorb the levy or do source shifting where they export to the EU only from the most efficient installations? And then on top of that, we need solutions for exports, as was just mentioned by previous speakers. The European steel industry exports 20 million tons of steel every year. That is worth almost 20 billion euros. So we are, if we do not do it right, we may lose over time these exports. These exports would then have to be put on another market, on the internal market, and that would create additional problems here in Europe. It would lead to capacity reductions. We need a certain capacity utilization, otherwise we have to close some installations. So there could be a structural problem being created if we do not do it right. Already today, our sector has a shortage in free allocation, resulting in annual cost of 3.5 billion euros. We have calculated that at the carbon price of 80 euros. Now the carbon price has already increased more the last 2 weeks. The Chinese government just announced that they will peak CO2 emissions from Chinese steel production only by 2030. And they have not yet fixed any date when their steel industry would become part of a domestic emissions trading scheme. EU steelmakers are about to implement over 50 projects, reducing our emissions by 30% by 2030 in not even 10 years, in just 8 years. The capital investment is set at 25 billion euros for those 8 years, 45 billion euros of operational costs. Most of that is energy costs. None of our competitors has such a massive decarbonization program. Overall impact on our sector is even more complex. I can come back to this a bit later. We therefore can absolutely not afford any additional cost by losing even more free allocation already before 2030. Please let us discuss how we achieve the target in 2030 on our way to carbon neutrality, rather than setting measures to further significantly reduce free allocation. Now, this is possible in our view with the allowances available and absolutely compatible with WTO. Also on this, we could have a more intense discussion, hopefully later on. We are in favor of a CBAM or any other system that tackles carbon leakage, but the system needs really to work properly. If we don't do this right and implement the CBAM and the revised ETS with utmost caution, we will see a massive decrease in steel capacity and production in Europe, losses of jobs. And there I agree fully with Mia Petra Kumpula-Natri. We should look into reducing emissions, not jobs. And also Emma Wiesner put forward an interesting and important statement that, of course, we should not punish frontrunners. And all our big companies have the programs to decarbonize on the table. In the next 8 years, they want to implement these projects. So please, let's support them and not punish them. Thank you.
Thanks, Axel. So we've had tons of questions come in from the audience, great questions that are coming in, so I'm going to go to those shortly. I did first want to go back to Maria Elena on, so you mentioned that you hope not just that the CBAM would never have to be used, but actually that it would be gone after a while because all of the international partners will have equivalent climate legislation. But let me ask you, in the short term, until we get to that point, what countries is CBAM targeting? Is it targeting developed partners of the EU, talking the United States? Is it targeting China? What countries actually need to adjust their climate legislation in order for the EU to say, okay, CBAM is not necessary and we are not going to have to apply it?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. As I already said, CBAM is not a trade instrument, so we are not targeting any country in particular. We are just applying a mechanism at the border, which will apply on the product, not on the installation, not on the country, not on the industry, not on the factory, not on the firm, on the product. No matter where the product comes from, no matter how the product was produced, we will be calculating what is the carbon content of the specific good. And then there will be a calculation of what is the CBAM adjustment at the border. So it would be misleading, and it would not represent the real purpose of CBAM to say that it targets a specific country. It goes without saying that, of course, those countries that already have an ETS, which is fully linked to ours, they have no problem, because the price they are subject to is automatically linked to what our own industries are subject to. So, of course, those countries have no relevance for the CBAM. And as many countries are there who will have ETS systems that will be linked to our own system, they will be not taken into account for the CBAM application. But for the rest, we're looking at goods, not countries.
So you say that, Maria Elena, you say that the cost is just on the import and how it's produced. What do you think about Oliver's idea about that this should include indirect emissions from 2030? Is that something you would envision as well?
We didn't include indirect emission in our initial proposal, to be very honest, because we wanted to make sure we had the methodology to calculate them, and at the time it was not mature. So for the moment we are looking at direct emission, because that's also how it mirrors the installation system, which is on the ETS based. I am not against also having a look at the indirect emissions. We should understand how far these indirect emissions should be taken into account. But for the moment, we are able to quantify and calculate the direct emission that are considered for the adjustment of CBAM at the border.
Makes sense. Emma, I wanted to follow up on something you said. You were really emphasizing innovation, and that the funds from both ETS and CBAM should really be reinvested in green technologies and innovation in sectors like steel. And Axel was telling us a little bit about the innovation that's happening there. Would you say that is in conflict with Oliver's idea that in order to get international buy-in and in order to avoid retaliation, some of these profits have to be invested in third countries, in the developing world, in projects outside the EU? Is that money that you think should stay in Europe to fund both innovation and also the just transition social funding?
No, not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily have to be in conflict with each other. As I said, I'm shadow rapporteur on the ETS, so I focus mainly on the ETS. But also in CBAM, there's currently a discussion if the CBAM money, should it go into the EU budget? Should it be allocated into third countries and developing countries and supporting them in their innovation? Or should it go to the EU Innovation Fund as a separate fund, not in the EU budget? And it's a big debate about this at the moment. Me personally, I believe it's important that first of all, we support innovation, really boosting innovations in these sectors where it's needed in order to decarbonize. But it's also important that we are, showing trade partners from less developed countries that this is not about us. This is about decarbonizing, and investing then the money in third countries would be a way of doing that. But I'm also open to listening to the Budge committee when they're saying we should add more money to the EU resources. So it's a huge debate about this on the money side at the moment. I'm focusing on the ETS and the number of allowances going into the innovation fund or the net zero fund, which I think should increase.
Judith, let me put that question to you also, and then Oliver, I'm going to get your thoughts on this also. Judith, you're going to be mostly concerned about the Just Transition Fund and to alleviate the social effects of the energy transition. So would you be worried about committing proceeds from this to third countries and development outside the EU?
No, not necessarily either. I think we certainly want to see more earmarking of revenue from the ETS into the Innovation Fund and into the Just Transition Fund. And we want to see those social criteria and conditions put on those funds so that we're sure that the social dimension is taken into account when funds are used within Europe. But we've also had quite the start of a conversation in the trade union movement about the need to also ensure that we're not penalising least developed countries and others. So I think there's openness to think about where the revenue goes. Where we are very concerned, I should say, is that CBAM becomes, and the ETS revenues become a source to repay the debt, and are solely seen as a kind of cash cow to repay the debt of the pandemic. That for us is really dangerous, considering the scale of investment which is needed in terms of decarbonisation. So we're very actively supporting the idea that the Innovation Fund, and whether it changes name or not, that's marginal in some ways, but the amount of earmarking into the Innovation Fund and the Just Transition Fund are increased in the future.
So Oliver, let me get you to respond to that. I mean, obviously where this funding goes is going to be very contentious. Everybody has their own ideas about where it should go. Do you think there would be a pushback to the idea of some of it leaving Europe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think there's two different streams of funding you need to talk about, right? So one is the actual money collected at the border from the CBAM itself, which I think is the money we're mainly talking about here. And the second stream is the potential additional flow of funds into the Innovation Fund that could come from auctioning more allowances to CBAM sectors. And they're two different sources of funding, right? So what we're essentially saying is the contentious issue with developing countries is the tax on their products coming into the EU. So for diplomatic reasons and for the sake of also just fulfilling our commitments on international climate finance under the Paris Agreement, it would make sense to return an equivalent amount of money to those funds from the border, the direct CBAM revenues, to those countries. And actually there is, I think, quite some support for that. The main concern, as Judith says, is that at the moment in the Budget Committee, the own resources discussion wants to basically allocate 75% of that money just to paying back Next Generation EU, which is not necessarily, I think, a good idea, because that would only contribute a fraction of the total pie that you would need to pay back Next Generation EU borrowing. And so we think in this case, it might be more strategic to use that small fraction of money externally. The indirect revenues from the CBAM that could come into the Innovation Fund, that money needs to desperately go back to CBAM sectors to accelerate their decarbonisation, because otherwise we risk having effectively a kind of two-speed Europe, where some countries will have the money and capacity to invest in carbon contracts for difference and other very ambitious sort of schemes to decarbonize their installations, and other member states will be left behind, and this will create conflict and a great challenge, I think, for the industrial transition as a whole.
Thanks. Well, I want to go to the audience questions because we have so many of them. So the first question I'm going to put to Mia Petra. This question is from Leon from Sustainable PA. Do the MEPs agree that free allowances, if not removed tomorrow, should only be targeting sustainable frontrunners, but that the current ETS benchmark system, which determines the FA handouts, is currently not targeting the front runners enough? Do they agree that this system should be revised ASAP? What do you think about that, Mia Petra?
In principle, yes, I think we do agree that the best ones should show the way, and also the tricky question of what is technically feasible. We have more experiences and cases now that we have fossil-free steel production going on, a very high demand, more than they can sell, even if it's more costly today. So also this gives an example that, yes, we are on the right track. But then also, and this is now I keep to my personal opinions as the discussions are going on, we also should try to create a system that is as much market-based as possible. And we then also see that the companies who are doing better, they also can finance the transition themselves if we don't squeeze them too much. But then it's of course the question how much we trust the roadmaps that the sector has given us, the politicians. And I'm so happy that at this moment we work with the sectors and the industry that has the roadmaps, that has plans to decarbonize. So this is, if we play this right, we will boost it, maybe get it quicker, and not kill those ones who have their plans to produce, for example, fossil-free steel and cut the emissions by 90%. The wrong decision, if we make them, is that we squeeze too much, and then they do not have revenues to make the reinstallations, to modernize the site and factories, and start producing free. So it's not very easy to do it if you do it only ideologically, that yes, there is one factory who can do it, let's only give them the free allowances, and the next others will pay, and pay so much that they are not anymore on the markets. So finding that balance is very important, but yes, there is a strong support of fading out the free allowances, and then the principle that polluter pays is the basics here. The whole ETS is actually a awarding system and polluter pays systems, that once you don't pollute, you don't have this extra cost, and this is world and way to go.
So you mentioned some of the efforts that the industry is making to decarbonize, and that's related to our next question from the audience, which is for Axel. This question comes from Ola Hansen from H2 Green Steel, and it's really about what do we mean when we say green steel? So Ola asks, do you agree that in order for steel to be considered green steel, it needs to result in significant emissions reductions, e.g. at least 90% compared to current GHG emissions per ton of steel?
Yes, of course, I agree that green steel, we need to be able to identify and to measure what is green steel and what can be labeled as green steel. We are currently working on a system, and I hope we come to a conclusion within our sector where we identify the road to green steel and how we can classify that. We need, of course, a transition. You cannot say what you sell tomorrow as green steel absolutely has to be 100% decarbonized. So we need a kind of phase in of this as well, and maybe then it's not called green steel, but in a different way, low CO2 steel, whatever. So we should discuss this, start the discussion on that. So that we come very soon to some more, let's say, certainty how this can be implemented.
Emma, I know you have to leave shortly, so I want to go to you next. I wonder if you also have a comment on the Frontrunners issue, whether the Frontrunners should be the emphasis.
Yeah, for me, it's quite evident now talking about and with steel industry that we're now starting to see two different steel industries actually pushing very much in different directions. We have the traditional steel industry, and then we have the frontrunners, as I call them, the one really working on green steel, decarbonizing, using hydrogen instead of coal as an input into the production process. And if you are a decarbonized steel industry, and we already have quite a few of them expanding their processes in Sweden, then your political agenda, then your wishes on ETS and CBAM comes quite opposite, where the one hand wants to have more free allocation and more careful revision of benchmarks, etc. The other one wants us to phase out free allocation as soon as possible because it disrupts the markets and it punishes them who are frontrunners. So, I mean, you have to have that in mind talking about the steel industry, because the steel industry, it's not only talking as one industry, and we have very different perspective here. So what I want to do is to expand CBAM in sort of 3 dimensions. We need to cover more sectors, expanding it horizontally. We need to cover the indirect emissions, cover more and deeper, so also vertically. And then we need to go faster, and that's the 3rd direction. So really speed up CBAM. And I have to answer to what previous speakers been saying, that we need to make sure CBAM working and then we can fully implement it, and etc. I mean, what other policy areas are we doing that? Setting up a trial period and looks at the policy and are being hesitant. I mean, we as politicians need to make sure that we set up a policy scheme that works and then stick to it and believe in what we're doing, the craftsmanship of being politicians. So I don't believe in what previous speakers said, that we need to, sort of gradually or set up the system and then go for it. I think the Commission knows what they've been doing when designing it. I think we in Parliament should make it better in order to make it work, but we should not allow for a trial period, so to say. And I actually do believe that carbon pricing is an industry policy, on what Judith said in the beginning. Setting a price on carbon is what will drive industry and pushing our industry and helping our industry to become the most compatible green industry. I have an industrial background, so I'm passionate about this. I really believe carbon pricing is an industrial tool, and I believe we can create so many new jobs in this green steel industry and that sector. But then we have to dare, and we have to be brave as politicians.
Thanks a lot, Emma. That's very clear, I think. We've had a very pertinent question, I think, come in from Cécile Seguineau, and it's about this green steel deal that was struck at last year's G20 between the EU and the US. Now, this was in the context of those two sides resolving the steel trade dispute that was launched by the Trump administration. And I think the jury's out about how serious that deal is. But we've had Cecile asks, let me put this question to Maria Elena. How would CBAM interact with this recent US-EU joint deal trade in steel from October 2021, including, for instance, the development of a common methodology for assessing the embedded emissions of traded steel?
Well, as you say, the jury is still out on that agreement, and you may think I have more information than the average person, but it is absolutely not the case. What I can say is that if from one hand we welcome, of course, any kind of agreement that would make greener the production elsewhere than in the EU, I can only repeat what I already said. We would be looking at how the product is embedding its emission, what is the carbon content at the border. Then it will be key to see what kind of impact on the environment this agreement is going to take into account to see whether this would be compatible with the current design of CBAM. But I cannot comment more than this because as I say, I have no idea exactly how that will be played out.
I'm not sure anyone knows exactly how that deal is going to be played out, but Axel, let me put this to you also. Obviously, you were watching this with keen interest in October. So how do you think the CBAM is going to interact with that green steel deal? Will it at all? What do we know so far?
Yes, thanks, Dave. This will, of course, be core of the discussion between the EU and the US. And I had a discussion with the US trade representative myself in November, and she said they are interested in CBAM. So they're not saying no, but they also are looking for measures to be taken in the US. And the Commission, maybe also for that reason, has proposed in its CBAM proposal that a carbon levy is only implemented in 2026. So that gives also some room to negotiate with the US to come to common terms without the possibility that they retaliate already immediately. And I do not think that they will, by the way, if the discussion is successful anyway. Then not on retaliation that was mentioned before. I believe that the proposal we are putting forward to test the CBAM with the carbon levy first before further reducing free allocation is an important tool and could also ease the frictions with some of the trade partners who also do not want to see significant carbon costs for the exporters immediately at the EU border in 2026. With the current proposal of the Commission, the carbon levy at the border would be significantly higher than with the proposal to first test it for 3 years, then put forward a proposal or a report to the Parliament and the Council whether the system is really working, and then phase out free allocation quicker. The proposal to keep free allocation at current levels in the moment supports also the downstream industry in Europe, because they are also concerned about higher costs immediately. So they would suffer from a higher carbon levy from the start as well, but also the exporters to the EU. The exporters would also have to pay a higher carbon levy with the current Commission proposal. So we believe that there are only advantages, and it is WTO compatible to have a very cautious implementation of the measure. And I'm happy to further discuss also with the Commission and with the lawyers, with our trade lawyers, how this can be done so that the Commission is also a little bit more confident on the WTO compatibility.
Yes, because that is a big open question, for sure. I want to go back to this issue of the phase out, the overlap, and whether we need a kind of trial period that Emma was talking about before. Oliver, maybe I could get your further thoughts on this idea of a trial, or whether we really just need to go ahead and stick with what was agreed. And I want to put this question to you also from the audience, which is related. So this is a question from Matty Ray from RICOM. Could you please comment on the competitiveness of European industry products on the global market as CBAM raises the raw material prices, and there is a risk that European products will be too highly priced compared to non-CBAM products? And of course, that is the heart of the worries over this transition not going well, and whether or not we really need to see how CBAM has been working for 2 or 3 years before we can know whether we can phase out the free allowances. So what are your thoughts on that, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, this is at the heart of the debate, right? Is how quickly should we go? You know, I think that the points made by different panelists here are equally valid in a way. You know, I mean, on the one hand, yes, we do need to move quickly, because if we don't move quickly in sort of you know, creating the incentives for our industry to decarbonize and to raise the money for them to also invest at scale, we risk being left behind in a race that is now picking up speed internationally very quickly. On the other hand, we also have to be conscious that, you know, yes, there are some, you know, specific companies in Sweden, for example, that are able to move very quickly because they have very favorable renewable energy access and costs to produce hydrogen and so on. And that's not the case of every single installation in Europe. You know, you also have, if you think about doing that exact same technology for you know, many different blast furnaces across Europe, it's a huge scale operation that requires new power infrastructure at large scale, new hydrogen infrastructure, new storage infrastructure, new hydrogen transport infrastructure, etc. And you know, the idea that you can just sort of have everybody do that within the speed of the next 5 years, I think, is unrealistic. So that's why you know, you need to find a balance. You need to find a balance. Yes, everyone should go there ultimately, but you know, we need to sort of strike the right balance. The other thing is, indeed, if we do not have a dedicated export protection system initially, the exporters will be exposed, and it will be 20 to 25% of the production of some of these sectors. And so that's also a reason to not go too fast. So, you know, it's a tough one, but I just think we need to find an intelligent balance here, because otherwise we risk shooting ourselves in the foot.
Thanks. Emma, I know you have to leave, but I just wonder if you want to respond to that quickly before you have to go.
I mean, there's so many topics at the same time. I mean, just before I leave, I really think we need to be ambitious here when it comes to timeline and scope of both CBAM and ETS. We know with the current development, we're heading towards 4 degrees. I mean, transition is going to go fast, much faster than we in this house in Brussels can imagine. The steel industry projects in Sweden, yeah, well, we have a lot of renewables in our system, but still the steel industries up in the north still have to expand immensely also on building out renewables. I mean, the steel industry goes hand in hand with upscaling windmill parks also in the north. And that is a journey that a lot of steel industries can do. It's not a Swedish exemption. This is actually something that can be broaden up and wide scale. And I think it is important to have that in mind. I mean, the longer we delay the phase out of free allocation, the longer we delay in implementing all of these policy tools necessary, the longer we are holding the fossil industry under their arms, and the longer we are punishing or indirect hampering the frontrunners. And we really need to be very careful with that, with setting up the policy schemes that are not only here today and tomorrow, they're going to be here for a while. And I don't want to do something wrong. Now we have the chance to be the decade of change, and I really think we should grasp and take that chance. Thank you so much for a good event and seminar. I will have to jump out to another meeting, but thanks so much. Look forward to talk more to you guys in the panel and also the ones listening. Feel free to reach out on social media, or Twitter or whatever, and I try to respond as much as I can.
For sure. Thanks. Judith, I have a question for you from the audience. So this question comes from Bert. Several downstream user sectors are afraid of price increases due to the CBAM. Have you looked at the impact of CBAM on downstream sectors, and should these sectors worry? So we talked a bit about workers in the steel sector. What about downstream?
Yeah, of course. We, as Industrial Europe, we represent workers right across manufacturing, energy and mining, so including the automotive industry and energy sector and so on. So there has been a lively discussion. In fact, our position that I've been defending here today is the position of our executive committee, which involves the participation of all of those sectors as well. So it is still perceived as an important part of the policy mix to ensure that broader industrial fabric that I spoke about right at the beginning. I mean, our objective as an industrial trade union movement is to ensure that we have a sustainable manufacturing base in Europe that is delivering good quality jobs into the future. And part of that, part of guaranteeing the downstream sectors is also guaranteeing the foundation industries that are close to them. So it's obviously, and I feel like that may be the term of this afternoon, that it's a balance that has to be struck, and the balance has to be got right. But our position as Industrial Europe in favour of CBAM also comes with the support of workers across Europe in the automotive and other industries.
Thanks a lot. So Maria Elena, I'm going to put to you the question that is without a doubt the most common question in Slido right now, which is how this is going to be calculated, how the imports, whether or not a third country requirements are equivalent, how that's going to be calculated. And I know that's not settled yet, but let me just put a couple of these questions to you so you can get a feel. There's like 15 of them, but here's a couple. Katerina Svitakova says, how will it be decided whether an importer country uses similar enough rules to CBAM? How transparent will the comparing process be between importers' country rules and the EU CBAM? Leon asks on indirect CO2, would the burden of proof be on importers? And if they're not willing to provide actual data, give them a punitive default value if we're talking about indirect emissions, and of course that's something that would be in the future. So we have also from Berkman ISCI, will direct emissions in the steel industry be calculated realistically with flue gas analyzers, or will they be calculated theoretically from carbon ratio of raw material sources and process? Which calculation methodology will be used? So I think you get the flavor of the question there. People want to know, how is this going to be analyzed, the import costs?
Well, there are different ways to calculate different things, of course. First of all, you are referring to, okay, first, just to have a full picture, if I may, the way in which we're going to calculate the emissions and the carbon content of goods will be the subject of a study that we are currently launching to exactly calculate evaluate the methodology to calculate these emissions. And so it is now a bit too early. That is part of the implementing phase of the implementation of the CBAM. And we are preparing the terms of reference for the study. And hopefully this will bring additional clarity to that aspect. For what concerns, in general, the line of how many emissions we are going to calculate, we stand by the direct emissions that are embedded in the separate goods for the reasons that I have referred to earlier. As far as the abatement that you may have on the CBAM adjustment, they will have to mirror the actual emission. No, first you have to pay on the actual emissions, so the ones that are really embedded in the good, and then you can calculate the amount of carbon price that you have paid already outside. And this will be up to the importer, the one who is going to present the declaration to the authorities at the customs, and therefore we will be calculating only those direct costs that have been borne by the producers outside Europe, no indirect costs. This because it would be excessively difficult to calculate what has been the indirect impact of prices that are not directly linked to the carbon, so only the ones that are clearly linked to them. And whether that will be verified, we'll have a system to verify the certificate, the ones that are going to declare for the importers. The importers themselves can be verified. Whether we will be able to go in third countries and verify whether what they said is correct, that is a bit complicated, but it will be up to the importer to prove that there was indeed a direct price that was paid abroad that then can be taken into account to lower the amount of CBAM that is going to be applied. So this is, of course, the starting point that we have put on the table. I would like to remind you that there are still implementing acts that will have to be adopted. There are still elements that will be concretely explaining how CBAM will work in practice, and these have still to come. So I'm sure that additional clarity will be out there as soon as we will be adopting this kind of new concrete measures, implementing measures. And the implementing measures are going to be built on not only what is the evidence that we are going to have, but also on what is going to be the final result of the negotiations concerning CBAM. And I'm sure that any additional new knowledge and understanding that we will have will be factored in the future negotiations. And these negotiations will also be fed by the additional finding that we will be finding in the studies that we are now preparing. So it's a living thing.
Yes, it's a living thing indeed. Thank you for that. That's really helpful to get an overview of what is on the table. So Axel, hearing what's on the table there, is this also your expectation of how that's going to work, and what do you think could be improved in that calculation?
That's difficult to say right now, of course, but the basis needs to be the least efficient steel producers worldwide. That needs to be the basis to calculate then later on the carbon levy, because otherwise we risk to have free riders. But I would like to make another point, because there was a notion that only Swedish steel producers would be the front runners. No, the steel industry in Europe as a total is a front runner in decarbonization. We are likely to be the energy intensive industry sector with the most ambitious own target to reduce another 30% of our emissions in just 8 years. The 50 projects I have mentioned before, or even more projects, which are all on a high technology readiness level, are across Europe. There are maybe 5 or 6 in Sweden. The rest is in other countries of Europe. Those companies are also envisaging the use of hydrogen, but hydrogen, of course, needs to be available. And there, even in Sweden, with if SSAB, for example, decarbonizes all its installations, they are still not sure today whether the infrastructure is there in place and in time in place. And that accounts for the rest of Europe as well. Yes, Sweden has easier access today to decarbonized energy, but that is part of our problem as a European steel industry and for energy intensive industries as a whole, that we need also the infrastructures to be in place. We can, of course, and that is maybe the good thing about our projects, they can, in particular when we're talking about direct reduced iron and electric arc furnace technology, which is being implemented by SSAB and other companies, if the conditions are right, already before 2020-30, then we could run these partially with natural gas in a transition, and by that already reduce significantly our emissions. But that could, of course, not make the carbon neutrality reality if we over time do not have access to sufficient hydrogen. So therefore, again, there are no two speeds within the steel industry, and we have most of the companies are front runners. Just please look at the facts, at the planning, at our roadmap, what the steel industry has been done over the last 20 years to make the current status that we really can take off now if the conditions are right and if we get the support. That this is the fact. So we don't need more front runners in Europe. We have them already, in my view. Thank you.
Thanks. So we're coming toward the end of the session. Before we go, I wanted to ask you guys the number one upvoted question in the session, and it's coming back to this issue I mentioned at the beginning, the current price of carbon, which is closing onto 100 euros. So Eric Onstad from Reuters asks, and Mia Petra, I want to get your thoughts on this first. The European carbon price is nearing 100 euros. Would that price be a game changer for the steel industry? Mia Petra, is this price something we can work with depending on the contours of what we decide with free allowances and CBAM, or is the price itself a problem?
Price is challenged, but at the same time, we have been looking for the price that will also be a signal for the investors. And I have talked to several industrial investors that they do want to see the price to be stable and the system to be trusted so that it will not change too much, so they can count their capex and apex and do all the necessary calculations for the at the moment more expensive technologies to be used. So if we are not very surprised of the price, neither should be the industry be for the future. And then at least the good news, as this is my last time to speak, we will have a lot of money to modernization fund and innovation fund to boost and then exaggerate the roadmaps by the industry on the steel, for example. So I keep my fingers crossed and be quite positive to see CBAM balancing the phase out of the other system. We have to make that right and believe. But also we want to see, as industry committee has, as you heard, a little bit different tone as the Envy committee had. So how can we see, should there be a benchmark analysis on the way before finalizing our way to the 35? Let's see.
And that difference in tone is the usual case, I think, between those two committees. So in other words, a price that high is okay as long as it's consistent. Oliver, what do you think? Is this a game changer, a 100 euro a ton price for the steel industry?
Yeah, I do think it's a game changer because it's a huge increase in their production costs, and I think that's why you're already seeing it change the game. That's why you have indeed, as you say, we were talking about Swedish companies before. I know it's not just Swedish companies, Axel, who are doing things, but they have just announced a very ambitious plan to go carbon neutral for all of their units by 2030, I think it is. We see ArcelorMittal in France have made very big announcements also about what they want to do there, and companies in Germany, and I'm sure Axel can cite other companies that he knows better than me. But yes, we're seeing the game change already, and this is, I think, already because some companies are anticipating. Well, they have not just the higher carbon price immediately, but they anticipate also an eventual phase down of free allocation and a CBAM and competition. And that's ultimately what we want, right? We want competition to be based on who's the cleanest.
Axel, what do you think? Is 100 euros a ton, is that okay as long as it's consistent?
Of course, 100 euros per ton of CO2 is the envisaged carbon price by policymakers. It really depends also on the level of free allocation right now, because you need to understand that a steel site on average has 3 to 4 blast furnaces. It's impossible, even in Sweden, to replace all of them in just 8 years. It's not possible. So you will for some time have to run some of the existing installations in order to finance the new investment in the new decarbonized steel making. So for that reason, the free allocation in the moment is a key for our sector, and the carbon price makes already the trick. Indeed, that the companies are pushed much more. I think we are all clear about that. A carbon price of below 10 euros before 2018 or until 2018 on average has not made the trick to decarbonize the industry, because also at that time we had huge economic problems, the financial and economic crisis. So that was not helping to decarbonize the industry, but our sector has used that time to push the projects. We push these projects which are now there, which may not be there in other sectors. And therefore, the carbon price will help our sector in particular once a part of our industry has already decarbonized. So a part of each plant has decarbonized, and we can sell green steel on the market, create a sustainable market on green steel for green steel in Europe. Right now we are selling some tons of green steel and we have customers paying for it, but you cannot expect that they would pay for 160 million tons of green steel today, because we would be simply not competitive anymore with the steel prices coming from outside Europe.
Thanks, Axel. Well, that's all the time we have for today's discussion. I think, as we've heard from the policymakers on our panel, there's a long way to go here as this works through the legislative process here in Brussels. There's a lot of different ideas about how this should be designed, how the transition phase is going to go, and also what this money generated from both the ETS and the CBAM is going to be used for. So this is going to be a very, very interesting topic to watch over the coming months. Thank you to the panelists for some great interventions. Thank you to you at home in the audience for following along with us this afternoon. Stick with EA Debates for this topic. We'll be following this topic a lot over the coming months, and we'll be sure to be talking about this some more. So I wish you all a great rest of your day, and we'll see you for the next Your Active Debate.